This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it. Guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Hello, I'm Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, that's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, the title sort of gives it away, doesn't it? I'm here to talk about the stories of films, and I talk about production stories, development stories, marketing stories, behind the scenes stuff, casting, all sorts really. The films that I tend to talk about are mainstream leaning as a rule. They tend to be films I either like or have some kind of investment in. And it's quite a contrast in this particular episode, because one of the films I'm going to talk about I like an awful lot, and one of them I don't. I don't do snark though. I'm interested in the story. And with that in mind, I'm going to get cracking. I'm going to play you a little taster of a film from 1995, and I'll pick up the story of it the other side of that.
Wait. I have a riddle for you.
For me? Really? Tell me.
I see without seeing. To me, darkness is as clear as daylight. What am I?
Please! You're as blind as a bat!
Exactly.
That then was a clip from 1995's Batman Forever. I'm having one of my rare ventures into the world of comic book movies on this podcast. The film was directed by Joel Schumacher. The script credited to Lee Batchelor, Janet Scott Batchelor and Akiva Goldsman in the end. Cast led by Val Kilmer, Tommy Lee Jones, Jim Carrey, Nicole Kidman and Chris O'Donnell. Now, I covered in a previous podcast 1992's Batman Returns, the eagerly awaited sequel to 1989's juggernaut blockbuster, groundbreaking blockbuster really, Batman. And it's no secret at all that Warner Brothers, the studio behind these films, was heavily stung by its first Batman sequel. That Tim Burton had come back to direct Batman Returns, and the studio had afforded him more creative control to help lure him back to the movie. And whilst he delivered arguably the most underrated of the Dark Knight's cinematic adventures to date, outside of Batman Mask of the Phantasm, but that's a whole different story, the film itself was a lot darker, so it came out with a PG-13, the 12 rating, but the whole idea of it being family friendly, well, that went out the window fairly early on, and lots of complaints came in from parents. McDonald's Happy Meals didn't sell an awful lot, as expected, and clearly that's the key thing here. And crucially for Warner Brothers as well, the US gross of the movie fell from $250 million at a time when films just didn't do that. For 1989's Batman, down to around $160 million in the US, and those drops were reflected around the world as well. So whilst it was an absolute nailed on certainty there was going to be a Batman 3, there were certainly conversations about what Batman 3 was going to be, and more to the point, what it wasn't going to be. Now, this was a very different era. I mean, we're only talking about 25-ish years ago, but this was the point where you didn't lock down movie stars to multi-film contracts in the same way you do now. In fact, that used to happen where actors were contracted to studios for elongated periods of time. But in terms of franchise-specific, it just wasn't commonplace. So Michael Keaton was on a film-by-film basis contract, and he was, as the incumbent Batman, set to return to play the Dark Knight in what whatever Batman 3 turned out to be, and his salary was going to go into the eight figures. I mean, a number in the region of $14-15 million was mooted for Keaton to play the dual role of Bruce Wayne and Batman again. Tim Burton was the incumbent director, of course, but Warner Brothers wanted that course correction. It wanted that audience back from 1989's movie. It wanted the feeling that it had a huge event movie. It wanted to sell those Happy Meal. It wanted everything to work as it did first time round. Tim Burton, as it turned out, he'd have little inclination to come back for a third film. He didn't have a good time on the first one. He had a slightly better time on the second one, but he wanted to do other things. And so it was all mutually agreed that he would take on a producer role for this film, and a new director would need to be sought. In fact, an Entertainment Weekly piece from 1993 cited a studio insider as saying Warner Brothers didn't want him to direct. He's too dark and odd for them. Now, separate to Tim Burton, whilst the Batman series was growing, director Joel Schumacher was going through a strong streak. Whilst, I mean, in the 1990s were good for him, particularly the early 1990s. So, Dying Young had disappointed, starring Julia Roberts, but he's credited with discovering just Julia Roberts as a film star talent. He'd made Flatliners, released in 1990 to acclaim. 1993's Falling Down was not only a hit movie starring Michael Douglas, but it also seized the conversation well, and again it's a film still talked about now. He was also in the midst of making arguably the best screen adaptation of a John Grisham book, The Client, that was coming in 1994. And the way Warner Brothers worked is it liked working with its company of directors. So Richard Donner was regularly making films for Warner Brothers, of course. Clint Eastwood was as well. And so with Joel Schumacher, one of the Warner Brothers family, he was approached. Would he take the film on? So Schumacher had a conversation with Tim Burton and agreed to take on Batman 3, and this change of approach was well underway. So Schumacher signed on around the autumn of 1993, and at that stage Michael Keaton was still on board. So quoting Entertainment Weekly again, Harry Columby, who was a partner in Keaton's production company, was cited as saying the predisposition for Michael is always to do Batman. But even at that point, there was talk about him, the character of Batman, coming out into the limelight a bit more. That in the first two films he'd been relegated behind the villains of the piece, and so amongst the things that we were being teased was for Keaton, quoting Harry Columby, to quote, to be more of a player in the next instalment, and he may wear a new flexible batsuit to allow the Dark Knight more mobility. These were the practical considerations of the point. In terms of who was going to be the foe in Batman 3, well, the talk, even as Batman Returns was being released, was it was going to be the Riddler. To many, I mean, really, in terms of if they're looking for high-profile villains, which they were at that point, we weren't in the comic book market, we are at the comic book movie market, we are at the moment. The Riddler did seem like the logical next one on the high-profile list of Batman foes. Robin Williams' name was being bandied about already at that point as the logical choice. John Malkovich actually was linked as an alternative as well. And Joel Schumacher was considering bringing the character of Robin, even at this point, into the movie. The character of Robin had been written as in the drafts of Batman Returns, but was ultimately cut out. Marlon Wayans was in line to play Robin in that movie. But it soon became clear moving forward with Batman 3 that the film was getting, really quite a clean slate. So Burton was gone. Michelle Pfeiffer wasn't going to return as Catwoman. There was a rumour of that at one point, and instead Pfeiffer and Burton went off for a while and developed a standalone Catwoman movie that never happened with either of them. It would ultimately happen with Halle Berry and win a Golden Raspberry Award. Burton would go off and make Ed Wood next instead, arguably his best film. Kim Basinger, whilst the character of Vicky Vale had been name-checked in the second film, there was no way Kim Basinger was going to come back for the third. And so with these relatively fresh ingredients to work with, that was the plan, in came screenwriters Lee and Janet Scott Batchelor. They were hired to put a script together. They wouldn't ultimately be able to finish it due to commitments elsewhere. Akiva Goldsman came in to finish it. He would win an Oscar for A Beautiful Mind, but also he would write Batman and Robin. So there's a bit of yin and yang there. But already at the point where Lee and Janet Scott Batchelor came on, the talk was about making Batman 3 lighter. They did actually have a meeting with Tim Burton, and they'd agreed that the heart of their Batman script was going to be the theme of duality, the duality of the Batman and Bruce Wayne character. Burton signed off on that, but that seemed to be pretty much the extent of his creative involvement in the project. So the Batchelors did their homework. They began digging into Batman lore. Janet had been a Robin fan since her youth. She was drawn to the fact that there was a major character in a Batman film that actually had a female name, which was very, very rare in a Batman comic that had a female name in terms of major characters. The pair didn't ignore the huge shadow of Frank Miller's massively influential comic book, The Dark Knight Returns, either, which had been creating something of a storm. There is a sequence ultimately in what became Batman Forever where the cave discovery sequence in that, which is a deliberate tip really to The Dark Knight Returns. It's played nowhere near to the level that Christopher Nolan would in his 2005 reboot Batman Begins, but there is a real attempt to steep this in some degree of Batman lore. By going in on the split personality of the Batman Bruce Wayne character, what the Batchelors were settling on was they were looking at replacing some kind of love interest in the film, and they came up with the idea of creating an original character, Dr. Chase Meridian, and making her a psychiatrist, and the whole plan there was just to slightly deepen that whole split personality thing. However you feel it came about in the final movie, that was what they were going for there. Warner Brothers, though, when it came to the villain, the studio was insistent it wanted two villains again. Now, one of the criticisms of Batman Returns is that there are three foes that Batman is up against. He's up against Max Schreck, he's up against the Penguin, he's up against Catwoman, whereas in 1989's Batman, it's a fairly straightforward Batman versus the Joker tale. But Warner Brothers were liking the idea of multiple villains, and whilst the screenwriters were resistant to the idea, the studio won out in this case. And so the decision was made, as well as the Riddler, who they'd adopted by this point as one of the characters in the film, to bring Harvey Two-Face in. The character of Harvey Two-Face had been seeded earlier in Burton's Batman films with the casting of Billy D. Williams as Harvey Dent, who in the comics, of course, turns into Two-Face. Again, we saw this play out better in Christopher Nolan's film, The Dark Knight, in this instance. But it was clear that Billy D. Williams was not going to be asked to reprise that role, and a change was being made. One of the things, though, to counterbalance the number of villains was the Batchelors felt that if you had more villains, you needed more heroes as well. Ultimately, the decision was made at that point that Robin should be part of the screenplay, and this cast of characters got bigger. Now, one of the criticisms that's aimed at these films is there's too many characters to juggle and such like. I do actually think that the recent Avengers movies do counter that argument a little, in that what they show is it's possible to write a screenplay that balances having a lot of characters and giving them all something to do, which I think on the whole the Avengers movies were very successful at. I think the earlier Batman films struggled with that, but nonetheless, there we were now going to have Batman and Robin versus the Riddler and Two-Face, and the choice of those villains was designed. One would challenge Batman and Bruce Wayne's brain, the other would challenge his strength. So the rumours persisted that Robin Williams was going to be taking on the role of the Riddler, and Dave Iskoff has written a really compelling biography of the late Williams, and he does talk about this, and he talks about how Williams felt at one, because Williams was linked with the Joker in 1989's film for Tim Burton, the part that went to Jack Nicholson in the end, and Williams, Iskoff writes, said he felt it was he was being linked with it as an enticement to get Jack Nicholson to choose the part, which Nicholson ultimately did. But as of November 1993, so we're still in development here, Mrs. Doubtfire was imminent in cinemas, and Williams was first choice. And more than that, he'd been talking to Joel Schumacher about the role. He was keen. He was interested in seeing the script, and the promise was that he would see the script at the start of 1994 with a view of making a decision as to whether to sign on for the movie. Out of the blue, however, Jim Carrey became a star. First in 1993 with Ace Ventura: Pet Detective, a hit absolutely out of nowhere, but then also with the modestly costed The Mask that landed in the summer of 1994, which I'll come to in a future episode, which was a huge hit, primarily off Carrie's name and the excellent effects work. But suddenly Carrie became the actor everyone wanted to cast. I mean, he'd filmed Dumb and Dumber as well. This was such an explosion of fresh talent onto the scene, and he was offered and accepted the role of the Riddler. And this surprise casting, and it was at the time that this was seen as a shoo-in for Williams for some time, was announced in June of 1994. And Entertainment Weekly ran a piece at the time reporting that Carrie had agreed and negotiated his representatives within 30 minutes. Williams himself was said to have had concerns that the character was, quote, too intellectual and not as comedic as the Riddler played by Frank Gorshin in the TV series. And Williams also had concerns that the character of the Riddler would be overshadowed by Harvey Two-Face in the movie, especially after Tommy Lee Jones was cast in the role. As it would happen then, the role was Jim Carrey's. He signed up, and that was one of the casting puzzles solved. There were still other casting puzzles, though. I mean, Chase Meridian, even though Nicole Kidman got the role, there were other names in the mix. Robin Wright was one of the early candidates. Gina Triplehorn was in there. Linda Hamilton was under consideration. I've read in one news piece that I've dug out of the archive. But it was Rene Russo who was ultimately cast, first of all, in the role of Chase. Chris O'Donnell was emerging as top choice for Robin, and he would ultimately prevail and get the role. But Leonardo DiCaprio also was in the mix for it. In fact, in an interview with Shortlist a few years ago, he did say, I never screen tested. I had a meeting with Joel Schumacher. It was just one meeting, and no, I didn't end up doing it. They pushed him to ask DiCaprio whether he wanted the role, and he said, I don't think I did. Quote, as I recall, I took the meeting but didn't want to play the role. Joel Schumacher's a very talented director, but I don't think I was ready for anything like that, unquote. DiCaprio would have a subsequent meeting with George Lucas over playing Anakin Skywalker that went pretty much the same way. Whilst the rest of this whilst the supporting cast was being beefed up and people were signing on the dotted line, ominously, a year before the release, just a year, 13 months before the release of Batman 3, Michael Keaton hadn't signed on the dotted line. It had become known as Batman Forever by this point. And earlier in 1994, the signs were good that he would. He said, quote, in the second one I had less input, but we haven't even scratched the surface on what we can do with Batman, unquote. But the bombshell came in, I think it was July of 1994, certainly in the summer, that Michael Keaton didn't like the direction the film was going in, and he wanted out. And he hadn't been locked to, say, a 3-picture deal. Unthinkable today for a comic book movie. And whilst the studio quickly spun that he'd asked for too much of a cut of the profits and wanted too much money, Keaton just put out that his representatives put out that he just wasn't keen on the way it was going. Quickly, Warner Brothers scrambled a replacement. Now, William Baldwin was one particular candidate at that point, but they settled on Val Kilmer. It took a little bit of it took a few days to track Kilmer down, but the offer went out to Kilmer, and without reading the script or knowing who was directing, Kilmer said yes, signed on the dotted line. He was going to be the new Batman. One immediate consequence of that is Rene Russo could no longer take the role in Hollywood's eyes of Chase Meridian that she was cast to be of a similar-ish age to Michael Keaton and to work with him. But with Kilmer being younger than Keaton, they wanted a younger female lead for the film, and thus Rene Russo was released from her contract. The role would, of course, go to Nicole Kidman in the end. The last part of the casting jigsaw would turn out to be Tommy Lee Jones as Harvey Two-Face, and Joel Schumacher, he's just given a massive recent interview that's well worth digging out, but Joel Schumacher said he had no problems at all directing Tommy Lee Jones in The Client. He got on well with, it's fair to say Tommy Lee Jones has a reputation for being sometimes very, very testy. Lee Jones didn't really want to take on the role of Two-Face in the movie, but it was at his son's insistence he ultimately signed on the dotted line. And so by the end of that summer, 1994, it was all in place. The cast was in place. There was a new title. There was a release date of summer 1995, and Batman Forever was a go. Warner Brothers had its new direction. Akiva Goldsman came in, just did the final bits on the script. Now, you don't need me to tell you, because the stories have swirled around for years, that the struggles with the production itself were notable, in particular the frosty relationship between some people in the cast. So filming started in September 1994, and Tommy Lee Jones in particular was said to be very difficult and very unkind to Jim Carrey. Carrey mentioned this in an article he gave a few years ago, where he said that Jones on set told Carrey that, quote, "I cannot sanction your buffoonery," which is such a lovely phrase. And Schumacher stuck up for Carrey on this and said, yeah, it was Tommy Lee Jones who, in his view, was being very unkind and unpleasant to Carrey. But then there was Val Kilmer as well, and he was getting a reputation at this stage for being really quite troublesome to work with, and Schumacher was aware with that. I mean, he said to Entertainment Weekly in a retrospective piece in 1996, "I'd heard horror stories about Val and was warned not to hire him, but I heard that about many talented people, hired them anyway, and had no problems whatsoever." It would be fair to say that this time Joel Schumacher was less fortunate. Now, to this day, Schumacher insists that Kilmer is an excellent Batman. To this day, Schumacher insists he had no intention of working with Val Kilmer again. After a couple of weeks of shooting, Kilmer's behaviour had got to the point where Schumacher himself said that he and Kilmer, quote, "had a physical pushing match. He was being irrational and ballistic with the first AD, the cameraman, the costume people. He was badly behaved. He was rude and inappropriate. I was forced to tell him that this would not be tolerated for one more second. Then we had 2 weeks where he did not speak to me, but it was bliss." The film did ultimately wrap up, and Schumacher got the movie in the can, on schedule and on budget. Production wrapped up in March of 1995, and by the time it came to the film's premiere, it cost about $100 million to make, so it wasn't a cheap movie, but even by 1995 standards, that was expensive. But by the time it came to the premiere, Warner Brothers was more confident. It had a lighter movie, although that wasn't always the case. The first cut of the film was apparently about 2 hours 40 minutes and was much darker. There's talk of a lot of deleted scenes, and there's even the occasional whisper of an extended cut for this one, but I've yet to see online a Release the Schumacher Cut campaign. Reviews weren't great, although I do remember Jonathan Ross is still on the back of the UK video. If you find the UK video where he calls it one of the greatest movies ever made, brilliant quote. I couldn't disagree with it more. But the reviews were okay, but more to the point, the box office was more successful for Batman Forever. It was a more family-friendly film. It grossed more at the US box office than Batman Returns. It took $184 million in the States. It had an opening weekend of 52 million, and there was a feeling that this was a movie that this was a franchise that was back on track. Now, I'm not very keen on the film at all. I think it's fair to say that most people are far less keen on the sequel. But it's worth reiterating, Batman Forever was seen as a big success in 1995, to the point where, whilst Hollywood was at this point very much in the 3 years between sequels rule, particularly on big movies, Batman and Robin was fast-tracked off the back of it. One person who didn't go along with it was Val Kilmer, who was dropped from the next film quickly. In came another Batman, of course, in George Clooney. But then I start to get into the story of Batman and Robin, and that is a whole other story in its own right. Batman Forever, no matter how history writes it, at the time was deemed a success to the point where Schumacher was in the Warner Brothers stable with the idea of he'll do a Batman film, a Grisham adaptation, he would do a Time to Kill straight after, which was also a success. So, as much as I'm not keen on the film, this was one troubled production that came in on time, on budget, met the studio demands, and I think in the scheme of things probably sold a few more hamburgers as well, and that is what it was partly designed to do. We are at the halfway point of the new Film Stories episode then. If it's traditional at this point that I do a few plugs, and thus that's just what I'm going to do. If you like this podcast, please leave a review at your podcast repository of choice, ideally a hugely positive one. Word of mouth is absolutely crucial. I am a independent and don't have huge marketing budget. I don't have a marketing budget. Well, I'm even saying that. If you can subscribe as well, apparently that delights the algorithms that push this podcast up various charts and thus bring us to the attention of more people. I am taking Film Stories on tour. In fact, I will have done the first gig by the time this comes out. My next gig, this is being released in early September, so I'm in Birmingham in the UK and Northampton later this month. You can find details on that on the Film Stories website at filmstories.co.uk, where you can also find details of the latest issue of Film Stories magazine with Noel Clarke as our latest cover star, all up for order on that website. For the second film in this episode then, I'm going to one that I like an awful lot more. In fact, I love this film. I'm going to 2014. I'm coming to a smaller British film, but one, no shortage of ambition at all. Here is a clip. I'll tell you the story the other side of this.
What I'd really like to say is thank you. If you've supported LGSM, then thank you. Because what you've given us is more than money, it's friendship. When you're in a battle against an enemy so much bigger, so much stronger than you, but to find out you had a friend you never knew existed, well, that's the best feeling in the world. So thank you.
That then is a clip from 2014's brilliant Pride, directed by Matthew Warchus, written by Stephen Beresford. The cast for this one led by Ben Schnetzer, George McKay. You get Andrew Scott for your money there, Joseph Gilgan, Faye Marcy, Freddie Fox is in there, Imelda Staunton, Dominic West, Paddy Considine. It's such an ensemble. I'm going to come to that shortly. But for a film released in 2014, the origins lie in the true events behind it in the mid-80s, of course, but also with writer Stephen Beresford. And it would be Beresford, it would be really a labour of love for Beresford to get this film made, take him over a decade to do it. As a writer, he happened on the story of the London-based support group Lesbians and Gays Support the Miners in the mid-1980s, who were supporting the miners' strike that was also taking place around the same time, that saw the miners in the UK pitted against the UK government, at that time led by Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. Beresford hadn't been aware of this story, and he dug deeper about these two groups that you wouldn't necessarily put in a Venn diagram together, coming together, and he found the story that he wanted to tell. He's had a theatre background, and in fact he's gone on to some tremendous theatre work, as did director Matthew Warchus, and eventually, as it would happen, it was... if I get this right, it was producer David Livingston who alerted Warchus to the project, but also Beresford pitched it to him. Warchus at this point loves theatre. Most of his work in theatre. He'd written and directed one film, Simpatico, so he wasn't really known as a film director at all, and I'd still suggest he isn't, in spite of this movie. Now, Beresford put the screenplay together to the movie. He would get in touch with the real people it was based on, where possible, to do it. And in the meantime, Matthew Warchus was facing the immediate challenge of staging the musical of Matilda. That was his immediate priority at the point that the project that became Pride was ramping up. But when Warchus received the screenplay, he would tell me that, quote, it's the best script he'd read in ages, and he really felt a responsibility of bringing it to the screen. He did sign on the dotted line. It was Livingston who'd introduced him. They signed on the dotted line. This was a film that he was going to make. But it was not going to be an easy film to make. And the problem with this one was a paucity of resources, that getting a film like this off the ground in Britain was not an easy thing to do. And so it took the BFI Film Fund to put some money in. BBC Films put some money in. Calamity Films was involved. Pathé was involved. And you see this a lot with independent films, that at the start of a movie you get an abundance of logos, just because it's taken such a jigsaw of companies to get together the funding to make a film. In the case of Pride, that funding did come together, but even so, this one was going to be tight. So let's go through it. An official announcement was put out that the film was going ahead in the autumn of 2013. So this was announced by the BFI and BBC Films, that the movie was going to start filming in October 2013 for a period of 8 weeks, and it was going to film in London, on location in Wales, in and around the area in around the areas where the story was set. Now at this point the cast was confirmed too, so and it's huge. It's worth going over this ensemble as well. I mean, you get someone like Mena Trussler, who we don't talk about very often, who just has some of the best lines in the film, some of the best delivery of lines in the film. But look at this cast: Imelda Staunton, Bill Nighy, Dominic West, Paddy Considine, Joseph Gilgan, Faye Marcy, brilliant Faye Marcy, George McKay, Ben Schnetzer. And what you had in there actually was quite a division between older performers and new up and coming ones. The cast had come together relatively quickly. That the announcement of it was made in September. Marcy told me that she'd been making the hit TV series Fresh Meat at the time she auditioned. She'd auditioned in July of that year, so 2 months before. Schnetzer, meanwhile, an American actor, he'd been in the UK making The Riot Club, and that's a film worth seeking out. And after he'd done there, he had to go back to New York, so he recorded his tape there. He went on Skype with Walkers and Beresford. He did a few more tapes before he ultimately landed the role, but again, it was quite contracted. Beresford did base most of the characters on real people. There is one of the main ones, the character of Joe, played by George Mackay in the movie, is fictionalised. Virtually everyone else is based on fact, but then George Mackay is kind of our entry point into the story. The generational divide and the experience divide in the cast was notable on the first day where they came together for the table read. Marcy told me a story of how in awe she was of Andrew Scott, to the point where she needed a wee and was just nervous to go. And in the end, she would whisper over to him, in the end, after experiencing some degree of discomfort holding this in, if it was okay if she went, and he gave her the nod. But then, as it turned out, Andrew Scott would be a real bridge for the younger cast. Not that the older cast were being unpleasant or anything like that. It was just a way for them to cope with their nervousness of being on a film set, often for the first time. So Ben Schnetzer told me, quote, if anyone ever felt uncomfortable with anything, Andrew was the first to say, we're going to sort this out. Even if it was just, I wish I had another take of that, he'd be like, okay, we're going to do one more. And he's a great example of a consummate professional. He brings it every time. He's gracious, he's kind, he's the man. And there was a real bonding of the cast that appeared to take place there. They did, though, before the film went on location and started shooting, get a sizable amount of time to rehearse. And in film terms, they got a week to rehearse for this 8-week film. That's really unknown in film, really. It's nowhere near as common as it should be. But then both Walkers and Beresford come from a theatre background, and rehearsals clearly key to them, and they believe heavily in that process. But Schnetzer, he had the challenge of capturing the role of Mark Ashton. I mean, he really is arguably the main role in the film, the closest you get to a lead in the film. An American actor, he studied a lot of footage of the real Mark Ashton talking at rallies that was in existence, but also he admitted to watching Daniel Day-Lewis in The Name of the Father around 20 times just to kind of get some idea of his craft and how he was able to put such a character over. The actual shoot itself was a quick one. That even though it was 7 to 8 weeks, a lot of films shoot a page or two a day. I think Richard Attenborough, the late Richard Attenborough, was notable for his average shooting speed was under 2 minutes a day. In the case of Pride, this was going more at the pace of television, filming 7-8 pages of screenplay a day. Appreciating that it was mainly conversational screenplay rather than outright action scenes or anything like that, that's still a relentless pace. What was also interesting about the mechanic of the making of the film is just how close Walkers and Beresford were. Now, film is very rarely described as a writer's medium. You can talk to lots of film screenwriters who will tell you their stories of they wrote the script and then they were just dispensed with once it went into production, that the director sort of took over as the creative thrust of the movie at that point. Walkers wasn't having that. He had Beresford alongside him during the shoot. He would check things with Beresford during the shoot. In fact, he would describe Beresford as almost, he said, it's quote, it was like having a co-director at some points. Walkers was also keenly aware of the challenge that he was facing, because this was a film where the events within it last around a year, but crucially also has a large number of characters, a limited number of setups that they could get through, even going at the pace that they did, and real time and budgetary pressure. They initially in the development phase faced pressure to cut the character count down to make it a bit more manageable, but both Walters and Beresford resisted that. They didn't want to distill the story down, in their words, to individual heroes, that this was an ensemble effort. And to help get through, really, to manage the schedule, there are lots of shots in the movie, fairly uncommonly, of lots of wide shots with lots of characters in. they got it in the can. They did manage to hit that deadline, and then in the edit, the collaboration between Waters and Beresford was just as tight that Beresford was invited in to the editing suite with Waters as he was shaping and toning the film. There were even down to checking with him if it was okay to come into a scene a bit later, to just change this, just to cut that a little bit. And they were very tight collaborators on the movie. I remember when the film came out and the press junket came around as well, it was the same. They were interviewed together, and they were a fascinating pair of people to talk to because they complemented each other. They clearly pushed against each other a little bit, but there was a real working relationship there. The film had always been posited as a mainstream movie. They knew they needed to get it mainstream. They knew they wanted this to play to a big audience. And it would ultimately premiere at the Cannes Film Festival in 2014, on the 23rd of May, the Cannes Film Festival, as it happened. And this was at the point where they'd done some testing to that point. So Stephen Beresford, by this stage, knew that what they had was more than likely working. But it was that first public screening that would really be the first test. Now, it wasn't screening at a great time. It was screening at 10 a.m. in the morning. And there was some nattering before and some talk that films don't tend to play that well that early in the morning. Nonetheless, the filmmakers were invited to hear the last to hear the last 5 minutes of the screening. They didn't sit through the whole film; they just went in at the end. So they nervously walked in, and as the final credits rolled, the audience started applauding the individual card for each character. In Beresford's words, quote, "It was like they were watching a play," unquote. Then what happened was a 15-minute standing ovation. Quoting Beresford again, quote, "It was absurd. We walked on the stage and stood there with all these people applauding," unquote. And he did tell me that there's something quite odd about when you're being applauded for 15 minutes, because you start to, the impact of it, you start to have to fill the time a little bit. And he just said he complimented George Mackay on his shoes while this audience in front of him was on his feet. But clearly they were bowled over by the reaction to the movie. The film would be released in UK cinemas in September of 2014, and it was a good, if not a huge, hit. Whereas the comparisons were put in reviews, ecstatic reviews, including one of my own, seeing films like The Full Monty and Brassed Off and Billy Elliot. Very funny films with just a heart of steel, with just steel running through them. In the case of Pride, there was just a slightly more difficult marketing job. That how do you get across so many different facets to it? Whereas something like The Full Monty, with the best will in the world, I love The Full Monty, but the idea is that these blokes become strippers. That's a fairly easy line to sell. It was slightly trickier with Pride, and the fact that it did register as a good box office hit is immensely to its credit. And in fact, when it debuted on the BBC free-to-air television one Christmas, the viewing figures of that were really spiked. Furthermore, the film would go on to earn producer Livingston and Stephen Beresford a BAFTA award, and as Beresford would say in his BAFTA acceptance speech, it was, quote, "the most commercially successful film about gay and lesbian activists in a mining dispute that ends in defeat of all time," which is roughly summing up the job that they had to sell the movie in the first place. The film wasn't a huge hit in the US. It got a far more modest release then, but it did come back to notoriety in early 2015 when it became clear that the film's DVD cover in America had been toned down. That, much to the annoyance of its creator, CBS Films, the company who distributed the film in the US, had, for the DVD release, references to homosexuality had been removed from the box art altogether, which was odd, but it gave the film a disappointing, clearly. It did give the film a fresh burst of publicity, which I guess is the only upside you can take from that. Beresford again was joking around the time. It took 20 years, he said, to convince anyone that a film about a vegan lesbian activist was a surefire hit. But this was a film that really resonated and really hit, and it's the kind of film, whenever I talk to anyone about it, if they've seen it, their eyes just light up at the thought of it. Incredibly funny, and really incredibly moving as well. But Walker's, he's gone back to theatre since, and he hasn't directed a film since, although he's consistently toying with the idea of bringing the Matilda musical to the big screen, although as I understand it, the earliest he was able to do that was 2019, so quite where the rights for that are, I don't know. Beresford more recently has penned co-written the screenplay for Tolkien and has been busy in theatre as well. So these talents are still out there, and hopefully they'll come back together, find another story they really want to make, and manage to get it to the screen again. The fact that Pride A got through the system, B came out so well, and C was also a hit even before the BAFTA, I think is really something to celebrate. I'm happy to celebrate it a little bit more than Batman Forever. That then has been the latest episode of Film Stories with Simon Brew. Thank you so much for downloading and listening. You can find me on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can find the entire Film Stories project at Film Stories Pod. If you're looking for us on Facebook, that's facebook.com/filmstoriesonline. There's a whole host of exclusive video film stories that we only put on there at youtube.com/filmstories. You can find the Film Stories website as well at www.filmstories.co.uk, where you can find out about Film Stories print magazine, about Film Stories events, about Film Stories Junior print magazine. I'll have more news on the next issue of that soon. Thank you as always for all your support. You all take care of yourselves, and I'll be back soon with another bunch of film stories. Bye bye.